tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Ko te mitu tai ki tō tātou kaihanga, ko i te whakatimata, whakamutunga mea katoa, no reira, mihi mai ki aia, ko i te whakatimata o ngā mea katoa o tēnei ata, no reira, tēnā koe. Te pakutunuku, tēnei roki, iwi kāingo konei, koutou mā tēnā koutou. Ngā rangatira, rangi whakehu, morehu, tēnā kōrua, mō kōrua tiakitanga mō tō tātou mahi, mai tēnei kupapa, ngā memo te whānau o te kotaitanga, te horangatira, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou mā. Ngā kawhakahaere o tēnei mea, tēnā kōrua. Koutou mā, te whānau, hui mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Okay. If you thought I was speaking in English, I wasn't. So I was actually saying hello to everybody in New Zealand's official language. The other one's the sign language, isn't it? That's right. I don't know where English fits in this, but anyway, we'll now turn to a non-official language of New Zealand to explain my ideas. Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, it makes sense. All right, let's go. So thank you. I was just saying hello to everybody and thanking particularly our kaumātua for coming from our project team and the organisers of this conference. And thank you very much for inviting me along. And it's been really great to catch up with Michael after all these years, to see that our paths haven't actually diverted too far from where we started off. When you said 1972, I thought, oh, macaroni. It's a long time ago, isn't it? Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is what influences Paulo Freire's thinking had upon the development of a project such as this, which, by the way, I'm no longer the director of. I've stepped down, and Dr. Mary Berryman over there is now the director of it. But I was the director for 12 years or so as it developed and became part and parcel of New Zealand's education scene, I hope, and I hope it will remain that way. But given present government policy, one never knows. Nevertheless, anyway, here we go. So what influence did Paulo Freire have upon the development of a project such as this for Indigenous people in New Zealand, for improving the educational achievement and the life's opportunities and lifestyles of an Indigenous population in our country? And it's based upon this book, which was published by Sense about last year. And this is actually a compilation of 3 major articles that I've written over the last 20 years. One's about doing research, one is about educational change in classrooms, and one's about educational change in schools and education systems. And what I'm going to talk about today is essentially this book. It's based upon the idea, the first idea from Paulo Freire is this notion, that really it's the power that comes from the oppressed groups that will liberate us. And it's not the power that will actually come from the oppressors because they're too busy oppressing. And it's a very simple statement, and it's on the second page of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it was something that really appealed to me a long time ago, as really makes excellent sense. And what I want to do is talk about how the epistemological foundations of this project have come from a Māori worldview, from the cosmology Māori, and an understanding, a way of knowing that it's Māori, and that it's developed a process called whakawhenanatanga, which is in Māori means to establish relationships in a family way, in a way that there is commitments and obligations and rights and responsibilities that are similar to those that one would expect in an extended family, the whānau. So let's go from there. The first thing was, the first study I did using this theme, I suppose, was a look at the diaspora of my mother's family. My mother was born in the South Island, but her father came from Port Waikato, which is just out on the coast there past Tuakau. And he was born there as one of 11 children of this woman, a woman called Irahapiti Haho, who was a descendant of a rangatira from this area, and a woman from Ngāti Pukeko in Ngāti Awa, in near Whakatane, at Porapora. And her 11 children were born out there and went to school out there, and they went to the school run by the missionary Reverend Robert Maunsell, and at a place called Te Kohanga, And the marae at Te Kohanga is Te Koteitanga Marae. And we just went back there last weekend to say thank you very much, because when we went out there, the first place I took the first group of teachers for Te Koteitanga in 2001 was to that marae. And at that time, the project was called the Year 9 and 10 Project, which isn't hardly sort of earth-shattering name, eh? So Auntie Nan and Auntie Mati, bless her, who at that time suggested we use that name Te Koteitanga. So that's where it comes from. So the names are rooted in a Māori setting as well. The story of this family had been kept quiet from us as the descendants of the family. Jim Ritchie explained this to me as a typical third generation search. The third generation was interested in looking at where this family came from, because this information had been kept from us. And living in Southland in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, being Māori, probably through the 50s and 60s model, was not the most comfortable of experiences. And so I remember my auntie, my mother's older sister, who was 20 years older than my mother, would always, she knew these stories, and when I asked her about them, she would always bang the pots together or put a cup of tea on, or something would always happen that she couldn't answer the questions. And so it was a bit like that, you know, the Sally Morgan book, where Sally Morgan's mother told her that she was, instead of being Aboriginal, that she was an Indian princess or something, you know. And of course everybody was descended, when you finally found out you were descended from Māori, you're always descended from Māori princesses and so on. So you always had to try and make it as though you couldn't be descended from ordinary people. You know, being ordinary Māori was really, you know, not acceptable. So that's the climate that I grew up in. And I was really interested in this whole thing, and so that was my master's study, was to look at the diaspora of the family. And through that process I found an enormous number of people and family reunions and all that sort of stuff, and also found that I'm related to half of the people that I work with and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite amazing. This woman, go back a bit to Ira Hapiti. When we had a family reunion in the early 90s, we found that she has something like 6,000 descendants. The largest family group on the Tainui beneficiary roll is actually descended from this one. So there's a very significant number of people in this rohe are descended from herself and her husband, and also from her father, who was a rangatira line from this area here. So what I then looked at was, I then did a doctorate after that, and I'd stayed as a teacher for quite a while. I was 14 years as a secondary school teacher, and I came into academic work later. I was about 40 odd. And so I did this master's, and then I went and had looked at other people who were doing work in this area and said, well, how are you doing this? What methodology are you using? Because when I started doing the family research, the family members said to me, we don't want you to take our stories and take them away and we never see you again. Because that's what researchers do. They're miners. They go in and they just take the stuff and they write all the stuff up and they write it into academic jargonese that nobody can understand, and we don't get it back. We want you to be part of our family research group. And so I became a member of this research group, and I became sort of like an accredited member of the group. And I got into this whole process of becoming a researcher in the Māori setting, and I was taught this by my family members. So it was a really interesting experience, and I was told, I had lots of lessons and stuff, and a lot of elders told me things about the very, very Freudian notions of naming the world and giving labels to people and using certain labels that you accepted that were acceptable, etc., were actually not acceptable and were really quite damaging. And so you have to be careful about these sort of things. I learned a heck of a lot through doing that process. So I thought, I wonder how other people are doing this. Because at that time, for example, the Koinga Reo movement had said there will be no research by anybody outside of the Koinga Reo movement in the Koinga Reo. Māori people were putting rahui, they were putting prohibitions on doing research. Oh, what's this all about? How could you do research with Māori people in a way that would be acceptable? Because research is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful. So how can we harness the power of research and make it useful for us and our families and our children? So I found out, I actually looked at this, and I wrote my first book at this time was called Collaborative Research Stories, or Whakawhanaungatanga. And it was about, I investigated other folk who were working with me at the Otago University at this time, and worked with them and saying, so what is it that we're doing that is acceptable to Māori peoples. And basically I found out that there was 5 issues of power that needed to be addressed. And it was actually a matter of establishing these relationships in a family-type way with its rights and responsibilities and obligations that were family-oriented that made all the difference. And so the issues, the 5 issues were of those of initiation, benefits, representation, legitimation, accountability. And you've heard from Linda Smith yesterday. I use Linda Smith's work a lot in establishing this sort of, in this notion. I use Dens and Lincoln's work a lot too. But I found that they talked about representation, legitimation. They didn't talk about benefits. They didn't talk about accountabilities. They didn't talk about initiation. So I was able to add to those things. So that's what the first thing that came up. And then, so there was basically these messages came out of doing research in as whakawhenua. And the messages were these, that is, establishing relationships is a fundamental part of the research process. That it's not something you do just as an entry process. It's not just sort of, I read a lot of qualitative researchers and they talked about it as gaining access to the field. Once you're in the field, you then took over. And one of the big crucial questions came up is what actually happens to the data that you get? And who processes, who makes sense of the data? And so I identified that actually establishing relationships was an integral part of the research process that went on and didn't stop. The second part of it was that researchers are in fact involved somatically, bodily. They're actually part of the whole thing. So when you get into it, you're a part of the whole deal and you're subject to and accountable to people beyond yourself and beyond your academic domains, etc. I mean, like for example, I learned lots of things from my kaumātua in the process. One day I learned, for example, that I shouldn't be using a particular term about our ancestors, our tupuna, Henepo Haho. And he told me off in front of a whole lot of people. Here I was sort of Johnny, the new researcher, and I stood up and I gave this big talk at this family reunion people, and I've written this big paper about her being what's called, well, I won't even use the term. But in fact, he got up and he told me off. And he was very elderly, and he had a stick, and he was standing up and really shaking, and he was really angry. He was waving the stick at me and everything, saying, don't you dare use that word about her, because she was a puhi wahine. She was a top woman. And you're saying that she was actually taken from there, and she wasn't. That's the stories that I picked up, you see. So by not being critical about these stories or looking at the impact of these stories upon the descendants of this woman, he told me that I was actually violating her history and also all of us as well. I also thought that I was going to cause him to have some sort of seizure or something because he was really looking very angry and he was going bright red in the face and waving a stick at me. I thought, oh my God. And the last thing he's going to say is, in his last breath will be, will be my name. And I thought this is not a great way to start your academic career. Oh dear, it was not a very, you learn things quickly in those sort of circumstances, right? Another time we all stopped at the family reunion. We stopped down at Taupiri Maunga. And they said to me, look, when you get there, you can give us a bit of a talk about the family, because the family comes from this area. You can do a bit of academic talk about it all. And when we got there, the kaumātua said to me, okay, would you do a mihi to those that have gone before us? So instead of giving this talk, they expected me to do something else in Māori. I wasn't very good at that stage. I come from the South Island. And that focuses the mind too. There's a different purpose. People have different purposes for the research that I was not aware of, but I learned quite quickly about different purposes, different objectives, different forms of agency over the whole research, and who I was I became part of the research team. And so I was subject to other people's analyses, interpretations, and aspirations. So I learned that. And then it was all about addressing power, of course, because the power over who sets the questions and who benefits from this sort of stuff. Linda was really strong on that one. And then the Dens and the Lincoln arguments about representation, whose voices and what authority do you have when you talk about this sort of stuff, and also who's accountable, who are you accountable to. So, and then I set up this at the end of 1990. I left Otago University and I came to Waikato. And I wrote a book at that time, and the hypothesis that I stated in the book was that if that applies to research, I wonder if it applies to the area that I'd come out of, and that was being a secondary school teacher. I thought, I bet it does. I had a bit of a hunch. I'd been secondary school teaching for 14 years, and I couldn't believe that our children were not doing well at the school. They wanted to do well, because I knew them, because I spoke to them. I spoke to their families. I knew their families at Takawahi and Marae and Porirua. And yet the kids weren't doing well at school, because one day they'd be there, the next day they wouldn't. And everybody said it's absenteeism. Yeah, sure. There was also the fact they were caught smoking, and they were down the road, etc. There was a lot of expulsions and what do you call them? They call them Kiwi suspensions. They'll caught you something. We're not going to fill out the paperwork. You just go home for a couple of days. That sort of stuff. Hell, a lot of that went on. So basically, in this book, we said relationship-based research practices can be replicated in classrooms. And what would it look like if you replicated those things about addressing power relationships in a classroom, initiation, benefits, representation, and so on? What would it look like if the person was involved semantically? What would it look like if it was actually about relationships? If relationships was foundational to classroom practices, what would it look like? And this is what it would look like. Establishing relationships is a fundamental part. This is the hypothesis that Te Koteitanga, it wasn't even born then, but this is what I've written in this book, was sort of based upon. You can see those. And then one of the really important things that came out of the study of doing research in Maori settings was that the setting discursively repositioned the researcher. So the researcher, instead of drawing from those particular discourses that gave traditional research type explanations and made sense of matters for the researcher, that is the traditional qualitative paradigms that were being used, etc., etc. Grounded theory, for example, was one of the things that I critiqued during this process, is some of these processes were in fact that when one works within a Maori setting, one is repositioned within different discourses. And within those different discourses, there are different modes of explanation for how might one go about doing research in Maori settings. And this seemed to me to be the key to actually understanding how you could research in a way that was acceptable and matched the aspirations and the preferences and the practices of Maori people. And it certainly has got a lot of traction, a lot of mileage with Maori groups of folk. So that whole business of discursive repositioning was central to the research, and I was hypothesising that it was also central to educational reform. And I want to show you how that is actually very crucial. And then also prioritising the meaning making of the learner means that culture counts. You actually work within the cultural framework, the cultural means of understanding, and that culture as a sense-making process, and not, as an Aboriginal colleague of mine calls it, paint and feathers. So we're not too worried about the paint and feathers aspect of culture, or the visible iconography of culture. What we're particularly worried about is how people make sense of the world and understand the world. And immediately when you start using Māori words like whakawhanaungatanga, you are part of a repositioning exercise. That language, the metaphors that you use, reposition you, because you're using a different form. The metaphors give you access to a different discourse. The other point is that co-constructing meaning about experiences means learning is dialogic and interactive. The process of doing research that seemed to me make good sense when you're in a process of whanaungatanga's research was all about actually developing a research relationship that was co-constructive, as opposed to I'll take the data away and I'll use a grounded theory approach to make sense of it. I'll do all the coding and that sort of stuff. That's why I developed the process that came from, the language came out of Jean Clandon's work with Michael Conley, and it was called collaborative storytelling. So I got into this narrative approach to research, and it was a collaborative approach where together you co-constructed the sense that was making place, and so it became a collaborative exercise. And you were saying, so what went on? Connectedness, engagement, involvement are fundamental to relationships, rights and responsibilities, and being part of the whole thing, and being absolutely connected to it, and also responsible to it, and therefore accountable for what you were writing. And I learnt that, I said, from the kaumātua and my family. And I found that other folk were doing this as well. And power sharing, self-determination through participant-driven research would, in fact, we could call it relationship-based pedagogies. So that's the set of hypotheses that's in that book, Culture Counts. And that set of hypotheses we then applied when the Ministry of Education put up an opportunity to engage in Te Kōtaitanga. So, and we called this, one of it's a clumsy title, but it's trying to find a better term for it, but it's a culturally responsive pedagogy of relations. I sort of put two conceptual processes together. I prefer to call it whakawhanaungatanga, but a lot of people find it a bit tricky on the tongue. But anyway, so as I said, out of that, we then said, okay, so what would this look like in practice? And this is when we start Te Kōtaitanga. And Kōtaitanga starts, it's a large-scale reform. Michael's introduced it, I've talked about it before, and it's been working, and I acknowledge the fact that the Ministry of Education's poured like $35 million into it in the last 12 years. A tremendous amount of money has gone into it. And we've had a lot of support from various people in this country, particularly the students and their families and their teachers and their school leaders. And I owe a great deal of gratitude to these folk. In fact, I've had the privilege of working with some of New Zealand's very, very best educational leaders, I believe, who are now running our schools. I've also had the privilege of working with some of New Zealand's worst educational leaders who are running our schools, but some of the best ones. You need to focus on those folk because they are internationally outstanding. Anyway, and we have, oh, excuse me, Auntie Mati has passed away. I shouldn't be using the slide. But we have Muruhu and Auntie Nan, who are our kaumātua there. And we have a large team of people. This is part of the Te Kōtaitanga team. Some of them are sitting down in the front row here. And this is us planting a kōwhai tree at Te Kōtaitanga Marae last year to commemorate 10 years of the project. So thank you very much for you letting us use your name. And we gave them a koha, and they looked at the koha, the cheque, and they said, you can use our name anytime you like. And would you like to use it for something else? They were really pleased. So it was great. It was a really great meeting of minds, and they were really thrilled, and we were thrilled to be back here. So we began Te Kōtaitanga by speaking with, doing the same thing as I've done in the research exercise with my family. We spoke with everybody we get their hands on, basically. And we spoke with the families, their students, their families, their whānau, their principals, and their teachers. And we found that all these people were drawing from three discourses when they explained their experience. We asked them, so what's the biggest influence upon Maori kids' achievement, and can you explain how come they're doing what's happening? Enormous disparities in achievement between Maori and non-Maori. You know what this stuff are. And so they either drew from the discourse of the child in the home. It's the child, they don't care about school. The families, they don't care about schooling, don't understand schooling, all that sort of stuff. Generally deficit notions about child in the home. They either said it was the structures and the systems. Pākehā structures don't match Maori aspirations. The bells go too often, those sorts of things. Or they said it was about relationships. You can imagine my ears pricking up when I heard people saying that the major influence upon Maori kids' achievement is the relationship between the teacher and the student in the classroom. So basically you've got three sets of discourse, three discourses. One is close within the classroom, one is in the school, and one is outside. Now, who said what was the key to this exercise? And, oh goodness, that's not good. Why would that not be there? I've got a really good slide, which I'd like to explain to you now. Bother. Okay, what the slide shows is we then got into the ideas, the unit ideas, and we measured unit ideas with a frequency count. Who said what and how often do they say it, basically? And essentially what happened was that the people who said it was about relationships were the students. The students were very clear that the biggest influence upon their achievement was the relationship between their teachers and themselves in the classroom. Like 80% of the things the kids talked about were about those relationships. The people who talked about the structures and the systems, I thought it would be the principals, but it wasn't. They talked about relationships. They said the relationships between us and the families, but within the classrooms, they are the most important things. And the families said the biggest important thing is the relationship between us and the teachers and between our kids and the teachers. The teachers, however, said that the biggest influence on the educational achievement of Maori children was the child and the family. And it's not surprising when you look into it. You go back through, look at the textbooks that teachers have been using in their Education 101 courses over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And they've all been full of deficit theorising about Maori families. They've all said the major reason why Maori kids aren't doing well at school is because of the lack of literature at home. The best bets is the only literature they've got at home. And the families don't have any aspirations for education. And they've actually tried to locate these people within a class analysis and say these people are sort of working class and don't have aspirations of that. And so on and so forth. So there's a very good reason as to why this discourse is dominant amongst teachers' explanations for Maori student achievement. And yet, when we ask people, so what's your solution? The people, the children, the students who told us that relationships was the biggest way of solving issues, told us time and time again of how you could solve these things, how you could change relationships. And that resonated with me dramatically after what I'd done on the research. The people that talked about structures and systems, they were bashing their head against the brick wall, because really trying to change structures and systems in education is really very difficult. I mean, I once said this as a conference, but I'm not going to say it now, particularly when it's a video camera recording what I'm saying. But I once said at a conference that I found something else that will survive nuclear attack. You know, there's one thing that survives nuclear blast. It's cockroaches, right? There's a second thing. And I said it was the secondary school system. I'm not saying that now, because at the end of that, somebody came up and told me off and said, you're telling us that secondary schools are like cockroaches. And I said, well, no, I didn't actually mean that, but if that's what you take from it, well, perhaps it might be the case. But no, I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying it now. I'm just telling you what I had said in the past, where I was wrong, definitely wrong in the past. So don't quote me on that, for goodness sake. But I sort of think there's a little bit of truth in that, because I mean, the teacher education program that we went through in 1972, still running the same teacher ed programs, and the structure of secondary schools, pretty similar. In other words, if you want to change education achievement by changing structure, I hope you're younger than I am, because it takes a hell of a long time. Whereas, and then when we asked the people who said it's the child in the home, and we said, so what solutions have they got? And they said, well, you've got to change the child and change the home. As a classroom teacher, how realistic is that? When I'm doing this, it's great to have Rowan here, because there's my wife here, and I always use this example. Imagine if Rowan and I had a difference of opinion this morning as we were coming here. Here is the thought, but that would never happen. But imagine if we had, and we'd had a difference of opinion over something. And she had an entrenched position here and an entrenched position over here. This would never happen, of course, because we're totally together like this, simpatico, totally. But imagine if it did, and I think about it all day, and I go back tonight and I say to her, there's only one thing, I'm clear, I've thought about this all day. In fact, I've listened to a few keynote addresses, and now I'm pretty clear the situation is that you're wrong. In fact, you're the one, I hate to point this out to you, but you've actually got some deficiencies in the way you're thinking. Your thinking processes are actually deficient. And what really gets her going is if I say, and you're becoming more like your mother every day. She finds that incredibly helpful when I say that. And she says, thank you, my dear. I've had trouble working out why I was wrong this morning. But it's obviously my heritage. And it's obviously the fact the way I was brought up. That's why I'm wrong. And I'm really pleased that you've pointed this out. The sarcasm dripping off the words. Now, what would be the most logical response to that from the partner, if you tried that with an adult, would be, where are you sleeping tonight? Wouldn't it? It'd be something like that. As opposed to, thank you for your erudite identification of my shortcomings. Now, if that is the situation that pertains to an adult relationship, how come we think we can get away with that with children? Because children can pick up on nuances probably more quickly than adults. And so if that's the case, how come if we're saying that the major problem is the child in the home, and why is a teacher's job is to fix you up and to fix up your families? How do we think, how come we, and no wonder we're getting resistance from Maori kids in the classroom. So you see, one way of explaining high levels of absenteeism might be that children don't value education. Also might be that they might be voting with their feet. They might be getting the hell out of something that's incredibly difficult. And in fact, when we spoke with the Maori kids, we said, how come you're wagging that class and you're not wagging that class? What's your favourite teacher? It's the teacher we get on well with. We go to that class. We never miss that class. It's great. Great teacher. What is it? Maths? Yeah, we love it. Love maths. What is it? Because you like doing all that, those triangle stuff and everything? No. We like the teacher. It's a great subject. We love it. We like the teacher. Why don't you go to that class? Ooh, teacher puts us down all the time. Stink teacher. Don't go there. They understand the value of relationships. They understand the value and the power of relationships. The teachers were still stuck in this discourse of blaming the child. So we got stuck into that concept, didn't we? And there's stuff about, there's a couple of books there, and I also got involved in writing a book about pathologising practices. The pathologising that comes out of deficit theorising. That is, remedial work, remedial programs, etc. You identify that somebody, you walk in there with a preconceived idea, a preconceived notion that someone's got deficiencies. So therefore you then do things that perpetuate that. Bart Simpson knew this. Bart Simpson was put back a class one episode, remember? And he said, explain this to me. You're going to put me back a class, I'm going to do the same work again, only this time more slowly, and I'm supposed to catch up with my peer group. I find that difficult to believe. Bart Simpson understood it, and yet we still perpetuate this process in our education system. And we wonder why Maori kids aren't doing well at school. Okay. What does deficit thinking sound like? I'm just going to look through this. This is a group of teachers that I listened to one day. You notice there's nothing in there about the teacher's responsibility or job or anything really, any agency at all. It's all about the kids. And there's generally a bit negative things about the kids. And I heard these ones. Oh, this is a classic one. And I heard these ones at a conference just in Australia, just recently. And I made the mistake, I was doing a keynote the next day, I made the mistake of using it on my keynote the next day. Oh, don't do that. See, they're wanting to learn. If they want to learn, that's fine. I can't do anything about it. Basically, it's teachers putting their hands up and saying, I can't do anything about it. I've got the same high expectations of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And she puts in the work and she got the results. This was one Aboriginal girl out of about 800 in this school. She put in the work, she got the results. What can I do? What can I do about attendance? They don't come to school. Well, what can I do? They go off and do all sort of things. They have these strange cultural rights. What can I do about it? I still pick up my paycheck, mind you. Now, this is a Freire conference, so a bit about Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire explains this very nicely by saying that the question is ideology. It's directly linked to the tendency within us to cloak over the truth of the facts, using language, metaphor, to cloud or turn opaque what we wish to hide. We become myopic. More serious still is the way we can so easily accept that what we are seeing and hearing is in fact what really is and not a distorted version of what is. So a precursor to this notion of discursive clouding, if you like. A very nice way of saying it. But it's actually an ideological position that's been promoted within the society. It's not within these people. It's not part of their belief systems, it's a discourse. It's a belief system that's been created in our society, and the roots of it are in colonialism. The notions of cultural superiority that came with colonialism, that came with the colonial masters in this country. They're saying these people need to be put into certain places, therefore we will demonise them, we'll make of them, we'll belittle them. We'll say that their sense-making processes in the world are inadequate. And so on. I won't go into that. It's the same sort of thing. And then again, Freire in his latest, the last book that he wrote, the one I used, Civics, Democracy and, excuse me, I've got a copy here. It's exactly for this reason that I, as a teacher, ought to be aware of the power of ideological discourse. And this is the key to Te Kote Tau. This is the key to it. And Paulo Freire put his finger right on it. And critical resistance to the manipulative power of ideology creates an attitude of openness in others and generates a methodological mistrust. That's what teachers need. They need a critical awareness of the discursive position, that the discourses they're drawing upon to explain their experiences of engaging in education with Maori children. And to allow myself to be open to differences and to refuse the entrenched dogmatism that makes me incapable of learning anything new. It's that notion of the methodological mistrust. So us as a project team, we had to put into place a process of developing methodological mistrust in the process. And so we used the children's stories to actually give the teachers a vicarious experience of what it was like to be a Maori student, and in that way allow them to actually understand what was actually going on in the relationship between them, what part they were playing in the power imbalances, perpetuating the societal level power imbalances that were taking place within their own classrooms. Because the ideological position they were drawing upon was actually was saying to them, there's no power imbalance in the classroom. You're a teacher doing a job. Your job is to transmit content to these folk. And if they don't get it, well, it's their fault. So that was the discourse they were drawing from. And yet what we were trying to say to them was that the children are actually in a different space. You need to understand their space and where you could actually relate to them and connect with them and collaborate with them. And then they will start to achieve. They'll start to participate and engage and achieve. And lo and behold, the closer Maori children, the closer teachers get to what Maori children told us would make a difference, the higher their achievement rates. And they're higher. For one group of schools had over a 5-year period, had a 250% increase in student retention. And that is, for every 2 Maori students that were in year 11 in 2005, by 2009, there were 5. So Maori students stayed on. This big diaspora of Maori out of the schools at age 15 or 16 can be halted. And the way of holding it is by changing the position that teachers hold. The ideology, they start critiquing the ideological position that's dominant in our society. And we use this book. This is the book that's got all the stories in it. And we give teachers a copy of this and work through this with them. And most teachers at the end of it say, goodness me, I had no idea that this was a situation. I had no idea this was the case. And what they also say to us is, so what can I do about it? They don't say to us any longer, why should I be doing this? Which is the argument that we've had for 50 years. Why should I be doing something? And then you get all this stuff coming out about Maori privilege. You know, the privilege of filling up the prisons and the privilege of filling up all the negative indicators in society, those privileges. I remember Elizabeth Rata being interviewed on radio one morning, and the interviewer, Catherine Ryan, saying to her, can you give us an example of a privilege that Maori people have over the rest of society? And she said, they've got lots of privileges. And Catherine Ryan said, well, can you just give us one? She couldn't, because there aren't any. There were some Maori loans in the past, etc., but they've gone. It's all gone, that stuff. What we've now got is the privilege and the non-privilege of Maori, being Maori in a society where Maori, the indigenous population, should be privileged for those. But anyway, a useful book. And again, what Freire has to say about this approach is that the experience of openness as a founding moment of our unfinishedness leads us to the knowledge and awareness of that unfinishedness. And the person who's open to the world and to others inaugurates, thus, a dialogical relationship. So moving from that book, where teachers actually start saying to us, so what can I do about this? Because the vast majority of teachers are not there to make life miserable for Maori people. They are there to improve the educational achievement of all their children. They keep saying this. They just have difficulty relating to Maori children. They don't know how to relate to Maori children. And what our project's about is supporting teachers to relate more effectively to Maori children in their classrooms. And when they do so, you then get this. You then get the development of dialogical relationships as opposed to transmission-type relationships, which Maori kids find, and most people find, incredibly difficult to cope with. as a teacher, and this is a classic one which just verifies what we've been doing using this approach, is that I must open myself to the world of the students with whom I share my pedagogical adventure. I must become acquainted with their way of being in the world. And Freire wrote this time and time again from 1972 right through all his books. You find this theme coming through about the need for teachers to step into the world of the child through some form, and we use that book, Culture Speaks, to provide teachers with a vicarious experience of what it is like to be Māori and a Māori teenager in this world. And when the teachers step into it, through the simple process of reading a book, as I said, it is incredibly eye-opening for teachers. And they say, well, what can we do about it? And let's get involved, let's get stuck into it. The same, again, same. And I think that last point down there is what we're engaged in, is the unmasking of the dominant ideology. And most teachers have no idea. It's the fish in the water syndrome. Most teachers have no idea that what they're actually drawing upon is a dominant discourse or a dominant ideology, that it's actually a socially constructed position. The position of deficiencies, a deficit discourse, is actually constructed, historically constructed, to maintain power relationships in a colonial society. So it maintains a neo-colonial setting in our society. Most people have no idea that, for example, to have the definition of institutional racism is where you actually have a school that has a distinct, different achievement level between a non-Māori group and a Māori group. Most people actually horrified think that's the definition of racism. Yep, that's the definition of racism. That's what it's about. And yet we're accepting it. We're accepting this fact that Māori kids don't do well in our school as though somehow it's inevitable. It's immutable. It can't be changed. So unmasking those discourses, unmasking those assumptions, that ideological position that's been with us for so long, is a very, very powerful way of bringing about educational reform. Unfortunately, in our current climate, it's too slow. Because you actually need people you've got to give people a chance to cogitate over this and to reposition themselves into an alternative discourse. Because this one's so strong, it keeps coming back all the time. And so it's very difficult. And so we work in a cycle of 3-year political terms, of course, and government want results, bang, like that. So currently the minister is talking about we want 85% of Māori kids to achieve at level 2 NCA. Well, we have in our project, of the 50 schools we've got, I'd say there are about 3 schools, 2 or 3 schools, where Māori children level 2 are now achieving at level 2 at 85%. They started off in 10 years ago at about 20%. And now they're up to 85%. 85% of Māori kids in these schools, and that's a bigger number than it used to be. One school had 20 kids in year 13. They've now got 120. And they're now increasing, so they've increased quantitatively, and the qualitative gains are also increasing. But these schools have been in the project for 10 years. That's the sort of time frame we're talking about. Because not only do you have to make these changes, you've then got to change the institution of the school. You've got to reform the institution. You've got to change the goals of the school. You've got to change the whole way that the school's structured and the way that people actually relate to each other in the school. You're actually asking, it's talking about comprehensive school reform. If you want to go about changing the way that Māori kids are going to achieve. Now that's a big ask to ask a politician to swallow. Never mind. So, out of the talking with the Māori kids and their families and some of the teachers and the school principals, we developed what's called an effective teaching profile. And there's 6 elements to it, 6 dimensions to it. The first part, there's an understanding of unmasking dominant ideologies and discursive repositioning. Then there are 6 different actions that teachers can take place. And I'm going to go through those quickly, and I'm going to show up each one of them how that Paulo Freire had identified these in his books over the years. The first part of it was that caring and learning relationships are fundamental to learning, that caring includes rejecting deficit explanations. I've said that. I've said all that stuff, don't worry about it. No, and I've said that too. First thing, caring for learners as a culturally located person. That's the first thing that teachers need to do. There are 6 things that teachers need to do, and when they do these 6 things, Maori kids do really well in their classrooms. So, actually, why are you writing this down? You know it by heart? I should think so. I'm really impressed. That's probably Mike, by the way, one of our gun regional coordinators, professional developers. He knows this stuff better than I do, pretty much. But I'm still impressed. Write it down, that's good. I should ask people to take notes. It's quite affirming, really, isn't it? Anyway, caring for the kids as learners, just as, like I was saying, when I started doing the research with my mum's family, is that I had to actually learn that they were Maori. And coming from Southland, where we had little contact with lots of other Maori families, it was actually quite an experience for me to actually get engaged with Maori, what it actually meant. And I was on a steep learning curve for about a decade or so. I'm still on a steep learning curve. I suppose, I hope it doesn't get any less. And Paolo Freire said this: the climate of respect that is born of just, serious, humble and generous relationships, in which both the authority of the teacher and the freedom of the student are ethically grounded, is what converts pedagogical space into authentic educational experience. Wish I'd said that. It's cool. The second thing, by caring for the performance of kids, teachers have to demonstrate on a daily basis they have high expectations for Maori kids' learning. Paolo Freire said this: essential to this task is the teacher's affirmation of the student's curiosity, which in turn will generate a sense of satisfaction and reward in the student of achieving his or her goals. Nothing there about the teacher standing back and letting the kids do it. It's the teacher creating a context of high expectation that's responsive to the child's curiosity, the questions that the child's asked, which gives you a clue about a pedagogic approach, which we've developed called narrative pedagogy, coming out of collaborative storying into the classroom. We're using stories to generate kids' curiosity and questions and stuff, and kids fly from this stuff. Love it. My role is essentially one of inciting the student to produce his or her own comprehension of the object using the materials I have offered. So it's my role. I've got a job to do, and it's a professional responsibility, and I'm here and I'm doing it. So he understood this thing extremely well. Creating a well, secure, managed learning environment. Knowing our content, our pedagogical content knowledge. We've got to know what we're talking about and how we do it. Again, teachers do not take their own education seriously, do not study. We make little effort to keep abreast of events and no moral authority to coordinate the events of the classroom. Professional incompetence destroys the legitimate authority of the teacher. I'll give you a good example. Victoria University did an evaluation of Te Tiriti Taonga in 2006 to 8 over the 3 years inclusive. And of the people they observed who had been in the project actually were implementing the effective teaching profile effectively. 75%. That's internationally pretty cool. That's pretty good internationally. They also identified, however, that 25% of teachers who had been in the project were not actually implementing the approaches that we identified through some rigorous processes that were actually effective for Māori kids. And they continue to use those pedagogies, that is the transmission modes, the monitoring modes, the behavioural feedback modes, etc., that we knew were not effective for educational achievement of Māori kids. Now, that report, you'll all know about it, of course. You'll have all heard about it in the media and everything, he said sarcastically. You imagine if that report didn't get no publicity at all. Basically, 25% of the teachers who had been through a comprehensive program had decided that they would actually remain teaching in the same old ways that were harmful, that we had shown were harmful to Māori kids. Imagine if that had been a report on the medical profession. And the report had said 25%, after a comprehensive reform program for medical diagnostic techniques, 25% of doctors were still using techniques that had been shown to be harmful to their patients. That would have been on the blinking first item on the news, wouldn't it? The TV news, 6 o'clock. Everybody would have been screaming their heads off about it. But when it comes to education, nobody seems to give a toot. Particularly about Māori education. Interesting, isn't it? Establishing dialogue, the fourth thing, establish dialogic interactions. Fourth. The aim is to reduce these things and to increase this. And we know, come on, to move away from the banking education model that Freddie talked about, to move away from the classroom on your left to the interactions on your right, to move away from the rows of kids sitting there learning, receiving the stuff, to the interactive, collaborative, interactive, dialogic, collaborative approaches on the right. Again, these are all the power sharing notions we talked about before. This is how one actually implements all those pedagogic principles that I was talking about before that came out of the research principles I was talking about before. And the interactions that allow children to bring their own cultural experiences to the conversation that is learning. And in this way, to actually create a social cultural learning environment where young people can be themselves. When this happens, they can actually make sense of the world, bring their prior knowledge to the world. And yet if we cut it off all the time, no wonder the kids don't feel there's any place for them in the classroom. The moment you do this, you have great difficulty keeping the kids out of the class. And I've even seen teachers having trouble getting them out of the class at the end of the lesson. They say, no, we're still going to finish this off. We're a bit more here, thank you. The teacher wants a cup of tea. And the last bit of Vygotsky and stuff there about interpersonal, intrapersonal learning, etc. Very, very clear that Māori kids just absolutely love this opportunity, as we all do, of getting engaged with other people to nut things out and then have a think about it yourself. And how does it actually make sense to me? And then using a range of teaching strategies and also using evidence of student performance to inform their next practice. And all of these things Paolo Freire talked about. He said teaching is not to transfer knowledge, but to create the possibilities of production or construction of knowledges. What a powerful thing to engage young people in. Young kids love being engaged in teaching like that. Because of the very process of learning itself, learners can circumvent and outmaneuver the authoritarianism of the epistemological era of the banking system. Kids know that it's rubbish. They know that it's boring and it's hideous. And you might ask, how come Pākehā kids will actually put up with this stuff in our schools? Well, increasingly they're not. Increasingly they're bailing out early. But the other reason why Pākehā kids actually stay and put up with this stuff is that they have hope. They know that they'll actually get through and they'll get those significant stepping stones on the way. Māori kids know they've got a hope, so they bail out early. They say, to hell with this, I'm out of here. And yet they do a haka as they go out. Now, our team does a haka at the start of a rugby game, and we love them for it. But Māori boys who do a haka at the classroom for inappropriate relationships and teaching styles are suspended from school. So we've got some anomalies in our society. We've got some contradictions in our society that we need to address. Oh, I'm not over there. I wouldn't want to whip over this too. I want to finish off. It must be time, is it? Is it? What's the time? Oh, it's 10 o'clock. I thought it was. Oh. You get built in time after a while, don't you? I won't do that. I just want to work through this. So, I just want to show you one last thing. When teachers create caring and learning relationships, that's what I'm talking about. Whakawhanaungatanga. When they do that, they're able to use more effective teaching interactions. And they see students more engaged in learning, and they see significant improvements in Indigenous students' outcomes. So I'll just show you this graph. Now, this is a graph constructed by a colleague of ours, Jim Ledward, from Newcastle. He used the observation data from our project, and along the bottom, he put together the first three dimensions of the effective teaching profile. That is caring, demonstrating that you're caring for the kids, demonstrating high expectations, and demonstrating you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about. And put those together as one measure of whanaungatanga. And up the vertical axis, put a measure of discursive interactions in the classroom. That is the use of prior knowledge, feedback, feed-forward, co-constructing learning in the classroom. And that's what we know from Hattie's work and lots of other studies, that these are the things that are effective pedagogies. We also know it from what the kids told us. They said, this is how we want to learn. This is how we learn best, when you do this, when teachers do this stuff. Okay, so what's the basis of it? And so what we've got here is we've got a correlation between, there we go, got a correlation between this as you go from, in other words, as teachers get more effective in terms of establishing relationships with Māori kids along the bottom, they are also more able to use the effective pedagogic interaction, stylogic interaction approaches in education. See? Can you see what I mean? I can't point at it. Yes, I can. There's a one-to-one. There's a correlation there, about a 0.4 correlation between the two. But what I want to draw you, so in other words, as teachers get more effective at establishing relationships, they're able to use more effective teaching interactions. What's really interesting about this is if you look at the upper left-hand quadrant, there are 3,500 observations in here from 1,350 teachers over 33 secondary schools. So it's a big sample. So it's way beyond chance. Look at the upper left-hand corner. There's not one example of a teacher who has a low level of relationships with Māori kids being able to use effective pedagogies. I'll show you the next graph. What's fascinating about this also is that the relationship, I haven't got it. This is not going well. Is that, in fact, the relationship between the whanaungatanga exercise at the bottom and the discursive practices on the vertical axis is asymmetrical. And in fact, as you go from left to right, there is an exponential growth in the probability of someone gaining, being able to actually engage in effective pedagogic interactions with Māori kids. And what that means is that relationships, establishing relationships, whakawhanaungatanga, is in fact fundamental to using effective pedagogies. Whakawhanaungatanga is identified in the research project that I started 20 years ago. It's about establishing relationships where people are establishing relationships as though it were a family, with the rights and commitments and obligations and responsibilities of familyness. In fact, creates those conditions in the classroom with Māori kids where you can actually use effective pedagogic interactions. And when you do that, as teachers go along from Group 1 to 4, Group 1 is the least effective at establishing relationships, Group 4 is the most effective. This is a measure of student achievement using a norm reference standardised test. In other words, as teachers get more effective at establishing relationships, all kids do better. Māori kids do really well. And so do non-Māori kids. So everybody benefits. What's good for Māori is good for everybody. What's good for everybody is not necessarily good for Māori, because we've tried that hypothesis for 160 years. Now let's try the other hypothesis. Let's target those people who are not doing well in our system, and let's focus upon them, and let's get teachers to establish relationships with our kids in a way that will allow them to use pedagogies that are effective, that will bring about these achievement gains for our kids, so therefore they can participate in our society and not be as they are currently. 35% of young Māori people between the ages of 16 and 25 are unemployed. What is that saying to our young people? That's saying, get out in the streets and we'll get the cops on you to make sure you don't get into trouble. So we don't want you, we don't need you in our society. We should be saying to our young people, we want you, you're an incredibly important part of our society and you should be part of this. So relationships, establishing relationships as whanaungatanga is predicated upon the notion that Paulo Freire told us about in 72. And that is, if you want to make a difference for the oppressed groups, you do it with the understandings that come from out of the world of the oppressed peoples, not from the oppressors. Because by their very nature, the oppressors haven't got it within them to make the difference, but the oppressed groups have. And that's where the solutions lie. And when you go there, the solutions are paramount and work and are ongoing and are liberatory. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. Pai rawa ki te kōrero ki a koutou, au koutou mā, tēnā koutou mā tēnei tā, tēnā koutou, kia ora no tātou. Thank you.